There are many well-respected scholars of a high level of learning who deny the authenticity of Mark 16 verses 9 through 20. Among them are James White, Daniel Wallace, Bruce Metzger, and Philip Comfort. I wholeheartedly disagree with modern scholars' conclusion that the verses are not authentic, and by the arguments in this video, I intend to show in summary that Mark 16, 9 through 20 is an authentic passage in Mark's Gospel and was in the autographed copy of Mark, and then removed in some later manuscripts, perhaps as early as the 3rd century. Negative attitudes by scholars towards the last 12 verses of Mark are a recent development in history, starting in the 19th century. Mark was considered a complete book for 18 centuries, only to be called into question in the 19th century. This goes wholly against the proper view of God's Word. Jesus said, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." Would the church have made the unwitting mistake of using a spurious passage at the end of Mark for 18 centuries, even 21 centuries? God's Word has been preserved by His sovereignty, and I can rest assured on that fact in knowing that the Bible I have matches the autographs. I find the scholars' arguments concerning these verses to be a case of chronological snobbery. In other words, their assertions may claim to better understanding now than people of past eras had. Forgive me, but I just find that unlikely. God's sovereignty acting through the church preserved the text. Furthermore, since this claim by scholars is a recent one, the burden of proof is on them, as the burden of proof is on the party asserting the affirmative of a case. The evidence they need to produce, which I have been astonished to find over and over that they don't have, would be hard evidence from the 2nd century or earlier, showing that the last 12 verses of the Gospel of Mark were missing from manuscripts initially. All of their evidence is 4th century and later, and all they can do is extrapolate backwards from 4th century evidence to try to say Mark's Gospel originally ended at verse 8 and verses 9 through 16 were added in later. All of their arguments amount to intellectual pontification about their much cherished ancient manuscripts, which are really from the 4th century. Scholars put 2 ancient manuscripts on a pedestal which are really corrupt texts. That would be the Codex B and Codex Aleph. Codex B leaves out words or whole clauses some 1,400 times and has many strange repetitions. Codex Aleph has many omissions as well, sometimes 10 to 40 words at a time. Concerning the manuscript evidence as a whole, the majority Greek text contains the last 12 verses of Mark. The majority Greek text contains the last 12 verses of Mark, as well as many important early versions or translations, including Jerome's Vulgate, the Peshitta, the Curetonian Syriac, the Philoxenian, and the Memphitic. I've only been studying this textual problem a short time, and I'm already tired of hearing about the Armenian version from critics of these verses. Just like the arguments that evolutionists make, they're constantly bringing forward evidence which has already been refuted. The Armenian version is 4th century at the earliest, which is too late for this argument, and besides that point, it bears inconsistent testimony to those verses anyway, sometimes including them, sometimes not. Another refuted claim is that they raise is the issue of asterisks and oboli. An asterisk or an obelisk in an ancient manuscript does not mean in and of itself that a passage is not authentic. If people were to go back and look at what is noted in these manuscripts by the asterisks and the oboli near Mark chapter 16, 9 through 20, many times the annotation is to say that these verses were in the more ancient and accurate copies, that they were in these copies. So the asterisks and the oboli are evidence for my argument. Then there's letters of the Church Fathers, which largely corroborate the last 12 verses of Mark. John Burgeon, in his book, The Last 12 Verses of Mark, gives 19 patristic quotations. These quotations come from Church Fathers whose locations span the entire region of the early church geographically and vary time-wise from the 2nd to 7th centuries. There are quotes from 2nd century church fathers, Irenaeus, for instance, Justin Martyr, Papias, that quote or allude to these 12 verses directly, by the quoting or alluding to them. There are also church fathers which modern scholars document as having adverse testimony to these verses, when in fact their quotations make the reverse argument. I'm talking about the quotations of Eusebius and Jerome. Their use of verses 9 through 20 in their writing, that is, those church fathers, Eusebius and Jerome, gives credibility to the existence of those verses at the time and their authenticity. Close inspection of the context and the overall intention of those letters will vindicate the argument towards the authenticity of the verses. The misunderstanding seems to be a matter of taking a sentence out of context, which is the same thing, this is like the same thing a lot of unbelievers like to do with Bible passages, as we know. The evidence that the Greek lectionaries provide is perhaps the most damning evidence to those who want to say these verses are not authentic. This is because the early church was more or less unified east to west in liturgical practices 4th century and prior. Not only were these verses incorporated in the liturgical practice of the early church, the reading of Mark chapter 16 verses 9 through 20, as we have it now, was given a place of highest importance, as the lectionaries show us, that it was the tradition of the church going back from the 4th century and prior to read these 12 verses at the greatest festival times, Easter and Ascension. That the early church would have tolerated the reading of spurious verses at Easter services is quite unbelievable. Also, the fact that the verse 8 ends a known liturgical lesson gives rise to the hypothesis about why the verses were removed in the first place. Manuscripts have been found where the words "the end" are written in Greek at the end of verse 8. This could easily have been a note to the minister for that day's lesson to remind him that the lesson ended at verse 8, and the lesson should not proceed to verse 9 that particular day. This notation was, of course, misunderstood by those who later on were ignorant of these liturgical practices. Scholars note several different possible endings as well, and I would refute that by saying that the manuscripts they occur in are not early enough to meet the required evidence which I stated initially to show that these verses were spurious. Finally, an argument that I should address here is the argument critics use from what is more likely. From its nature, this argument is speculation. I don't care what is more likely, I care what really happened. Yet their preposterous allegation is that Mark originally ended at verse 8, an incomplete gospel account, and they have no witnesses whatsoever to that fact from that time. In examining the mountain of evidence in favor of Mark 16, 9 through 20, it appears the human resistance to these verses as genuine is not based on any real solid evidence, but rather is psychological. People may not like the harshness of tone of Jesus in the verses. People may find it hard to believe that signs would accompany those who believe. But is the truth of God's word verified by our emotional response to it? Absolutely not. We are to take God at what he said in his word as the ultimate truth. Whether or not people like these last 12 verses of Mark really is far from the point. Thus far, there is nothing to refute the long ending of Mark as genuine. It has been in the text of the Bible since the church's establishment, and indeed in the received text of the Protestant church. So, I think scholars should take out the brackets and let God's word stand.